Dungan Revolt, the second wave revolt in Xinjiang. In this video, we're looking at the second wave of the Dungan Revolt, centered mainly on Xinjiang in the extreme northwest of China. The story of the first wave of the revolt, centered on the provinces of Shaanxi, Gansu and Ningxia, can be seen in the previous video telling the story here. Pre-revolt situation. By the 1860s, Xinjiang had been under Qing rule for about 100 years. The area, formerly known as the Dzungar Khanate, had been conquered in 1759, whose core population was the Oirats. However, as most of the land consisted of semi-arid or desert, it was not attractive to potential Han settlers, with the exception of some traders. So Uyghurs, at that time known as Turki or Turkic, and not Uyghur until 1921, settled in the area, with Xinjiang being divided into 3 administrative circuits. 2 of those circuits were under the command of the General of Ili, while a third, the Eastern Circuit, fell under the administration of Gansu Province. In 1765, the Uyghur Rebellion broke out in Tufan. It was a result of severe misrule and exploitation by the Qing authorities during the early years of the occupation of Xinjiang after 1759. After the conquest, local Uyghur officials appointed by the Qing used their positions to exploit money from the local Uyghur population. One of the Uyghur legends of the 7 Maidens comes from this rebellion by Uyghur girls resisting the advances of Manchus upon them. In the legend, Manchus are explicitly blamed, while Han Chinese are not mentioned by the Uyghurs as the culprits. The cause of the Uyghur Rebellion in 1765 was apparent when Manchu official Su Cheng commandeered 240 men to take official gifts to Peking. The enslaved porters, as well as the townspeople, revolted. The garrison of Qing Manchu Banner Force soldiers was slaughtered as the rebels took control of the Qing fortress. In response, the Qing sent a large force of soldiers to the city and besieged the rebels for several months until they surrendered. The Manchu officials then cruelly retaliated against the rebels by executing more than 2,000 men while sending around 8,000 women into exile. Later revolts included the Afaki Khoja revolt, where Afaki Khojas from Kokand led incursions into Kashgaria, meant the Qing government had increased its military force to around 50,000 soldiers in the region. These units consisted of both Manchu and Han, with the Han Chinese units being recruited in Shaanxi and Gansu and containing a heavy component of Hui Muslims. The Qing army was based mostly in 9 forts in the Ili region, with other forts located in most cities across Xinjiang. Maintaining this army involved high costs, too high for the local economy to sustain, and so required subsidies from the central government. Such support became unfeasible during the 1850s and 60s due to the cost of suppressing the Taiping and other rebellions in the heartlands of China. The Qing authorities responded by raising taxes in Xinjiang, raising new taxes and selling official posts to the highest bidder. Those that had won the bids for official positions would then recoup their investment by fleecing their local population. Increased taxes and corruption only added to the discontent amongst the people of Xinjiang, who had long suffered from poor levels of administration by Qing officials and their subordinates, in addition to the destructive invasions committed by the Khojas. Additionally, Qing soldiers stationed in the province were often not paid on time and were poorly equipped. When the Dungan Revolt began in Gansu and Shaanxi in 1862, rumours quickly spread in Xinjiang among the Hui that the Qing authorities were preparing a wholesale slaughter of the Hui people in the province. Opinions on the veracity of these rumours varied, while the Tongzhi Emperor described them as absurd. However, Muslim historians generally believe such massacres were indeed planned, if not by the imperial government, then by various local authorities. Thus the Dungans began to revolt in several locations across Xinjiang and were usually joined by local Turkic people, the Shaanxis, Kurdics and Kazakhs. Multi-centric revolt. The first spark of a revolt occurring in Xinjiang proved small enough for the Qing to easily extinguish it. On the 17th of March 1863, around 200 Dungans from the village of Sandoha allegedly provoked a rumour of a preemptive Dungan massacre when they attacked Tachi, one of the 9 forts of the Ili Basin. The rebels seized weapons from the fort's armory and killed the soldiers of the garrison, but the rebels were soon defeated by government soldiers from other forts and were subsequently slaughtered. Another revolt broke out the following year. This time, all 3 circuits of Xinjiang were attacked almost simultaneously. This revolt was on a scale that was beyond the capabilities of being suppressed by the Qing authorities stationed in the province. On the night of the 3rd and into the 4th of June 1864, the Dungans of Kusha, a city to the south of Tianshan, rose up and were soon joined by other local Turkic people. The Han fort, which unlike many other Xinjiang locations was inside the town rather than outside, fell within a few days. Government buildings were burnt and around 1,000 Han and 150 Mongols were killed. Rashidin Khoja was chosen as their spiritual leader, and over the next 3 years he sent military expeditions east and west in an attempt to bring the entire Tarim Basin under his control. However, this planned expansion was thwarted by the actions of Yaqub Beg. 3 weeks after the events in Kusha, a revolt broke out in the Eastern Circuit. The Dungan soldiers of the Urumqi garrison rebelled on the 26th of June 1864 after learning about the revolt in Kusha. Large parts of the city were destroyed, tea warehouses burned down, and the Manchu fortress besieged. The rebels then advanced westward through what is now Changlihui Autonomous Prefecture and taken the cities of Manas on the 17th of July and Wusun on the 29th of September. On the 3rd of October 1864, the Manchu fortress at Urumqi fell to a joint force of Urumqi and Kutchin rebels. In a pattern that was to be repeated throughout Qing forts in the region, the Manchu commander, Ping Zhui, chose to explode his gunpowder, killing himself and his family rather than surrender. After learning of an alleged plot by the Qing to disarm or kill them, the Dungan soldiers in Yarkand and Kashgaria rose up in the early hours of the morning of the 26th of July 1864. They first attacked the Manchu fort, which was located outside of the walled city, but it ended in failure, although it took the lives of more than 2,000 Qing soldiers and their families defending the structure. In the morning, the Dungan soldiers entered the Muslim city, and around 7,000 Han Chinese were forced to either convert to the Muslim faith or be massacred. By the early autumn, the Dungans of the Ili Basin in the northern circuit rose up after hearing of the success of other revolts. The General of Ili, Chan Qing, hated by the local population for being a corrupt oppressor, was sacked by the Qing government after a defeat at Wusu. His replacement, Ming Sui, attempted to negotiate with the Dungans, however, this proved to be in vain. On the 10th of November 1864, the Dungans rebelled first at Ningyuan, the commercial center of the region, before attacking Huiyuan, the military and administrative headquarters of the Manchu forces. Taranchis, Turkic-speaking farmers who later formed part of what became the Uyghur people, joined in the revolt. Then, when the rebels had gained the upper hand, local Muslim Kazakhs and Kurdics joined them. Ningyuan immediately fell to the rebels, but a strong contingent of government soldiers at Haiyuan made the rebels retreat after 12 days of heavy fighting in the streets of the city. Local Han Chinese joined forces with the Manchus, however, a counter-offensive by the Qing soldiers ultimately failed to bring victory. The Qing lost their artillery while Ming Sui barely escaped capture. With the fall of Wusu and Aksu, the Qing garrison, entrenched in the Huiyuan fortress, was completely cut off from the remainder of the empire-controlled territory, forcing Ming Sui to send his communications to Beijing through Russia. The next rebel attack on the 12th of December 1864 was successfully repelled as revolt spread throughout the northern part of the province, known at that time as Dzungaria, where the Kazakhs took revenge for past atrocities inflicted upon them by the Kalmyk people. During the Chinese Spring Festival of 1865, the leaders of the Hui of Tachang invited the local Qing authorities, as well as Kalmyk nobles, into the Hui Mosque to swear an oath of peace. However, in an act of treachery, once the Manchus and Kalmyks were inside the mosque, the city armory was seized by Hui rebels, and they began the systematic slaughtering of Manchus. After 2 days of fierce fighting, the Hui had control of the city, while the Manchus were besieged inside the fortress. Despite the odds being against them, the Manchus, together with the assistance of the Kalmyks, were able to retake Tachang by the autumn of 1865. The situation had completely turned around, and this time it was the Hui rebels that found themselves locked inside the mosque. The battle for the city ended with the surviving rebels fled into the countryside. The Qing government asked the Russians for assistance against the rebels through the Russian envoy Alexander Flangali in Beijing. The Russians, however, were non-committal, choosing to be diplomatic. A complete refusal would be bad for Russian relations with Beijing, claimed Flangali. On the other hand, Russian generals stationed in Central Asia felt that providing China with full assistance against the Muslims in Xinjiang would harm Russia's relations with their own Muslim subjects, and were the revolt to succeed and lead to the creation of a new Hui state, would harm relations with that potential new neighbor. St. Petersburg, the Russian capital at that time, decided against offering help to either side beyond the agreement to train Chinese soldiers in Siberia and sell grain on credit in Xinjiang. The main priority to the Russians was to protect its border and prevent conflicts spilling into its territories and among its Muslim population. Kolpakovsky put forward the suggestion to his superiors in February 1865 that Russia should move in force into Xinjiang's border area to protect their own border with force and seize the areas of Chujakag, Kolja and Kaskar and colonize those areas with Russian settlers. However, Russia's foreign minister Gorchakov dismissed the proposal as such a breach of neutrality would not be in their interest when it came to China wanting to recover those rebel provinces. Meanwhile, the fight against the rebels was not going to plan for the Qing. In the Ili Valley at Huining Fortress, located between Yining and Huiyuan, the stronghold fell to the rebels in April 1865 after a siege lasting 3 months. Over 8,000 Manchu, Shibi, and Solon defenders were massacred, with only 2 of the defenders spared. Their ears and noses cut off, they were sent to Haiyuan, the last stronghold of the Qing in the area, to inform the Governor-General of Huining's fate. By January 1866, most of Huiyuan had fallen to the rebels, with most of the residents and garrison losing their lives, along with around 700 rebels. Ming Sui remaining still holding out in his fortress within Huiyuan alongside the remainder of his army. Having run out of food, he sent a delegation to the rebels bearing gifts of silver and tea, offering to surrender on the assurance their lives will be spared and they were able to keep their allegiance to the Qing government. 12 Manchu officials and their families left the fortress with the delegation. They were received by the Hui and Taranchis and allowed to settle in Yining. However, the rebels would not accept the conditions of the surrender set out by Ming Sui. They offered an ultimatum: surrender immediately and recognize the authority of the rebels. This was rejected by Ming Sui, and the rebels stormed the citadel almost immediately after receiving that rejection. On the 3rd of March, with the rebels having broken into the fortress, Ming Sui gathered his family around him in his mansion and blew it up, dying together in the ruined structure. This was for a time the end of Qing rule in the Ili Valley. Yaqub Beg in Kashgaria. According to unnamed Muslim sources, the Qing authorities in Kashgar had the intention of eliminating local Dungans and actually managed to carry out a preemptive massacre in the summer of 1864. This weakening of local Dungan communities was possibly why the initial revolt was not as successful as it had been throughout the rest of Xinjiang province. Although the Dungan rebels were able to take control of Yang-Hisar, neither they nor the Kurziks of Siddiq Beg were able to break the Manchu strongholds of fortresses outside of Yang-Hisar and Kashgar, nor were they able to enter into the walled city of Kashgar itself. Kashgar was under the control of Kudleg Beg, a local Muslim appointed by the Qing. Unable to take control of the region, the Dungans and Kurziks turned to Alam Kuli, the ruler of Kokand, for help. That assistance arrived in early 1865 with the arrival of Buzurg Khoja, also known as Buzurg Khan, a member of the influential Afachi's family of Khojas. A religious influence, he was the heir to a family of long renown for unsettling the political situation in Kashgaria. Material assistance came from Yaqub Beg, a young but already well-known Kokadian military commander with an entourage of only a few dozen Kokandian soldiers who became known as Andijanis in Kashgaria. By the time Yaqub Beg and others mentioned arrived in Kashgar, Siddiq Beg's Kurzik forces had already taken Kashgar. They were then required to submit their power to the authority of Yaqub Beg and his much smaller but well-trained and disciplined army. Yaqub Beg's army consisted of Dungans, Kashgarian Turkic people, Kurzik, Kokandians, and around 200 soldiers from Badakhshan. Yaqub Beg was then able to take the Manchu fortress and Han Chinese walled city of Kashgar in 1865, but also to defeat a much larger force sent by Rashidin of Kucha, who has sought to dominate the Tarim Basin region himself. While Yaqub Beg was asserting his newfound authority in Kashgaria, the situation back in his native Kokand was, however, not going to plan. In May 1865, Tashkent was lost to the Russians, and several of his soldiers, particularly those of Kurzik and Kipchak ethnicities, appeared in Kashgaria in September 1865, having fled the new regime. Yaqub Beg's system of rule was unpopular among the natives, and one of the Kashgaris, the son of a chieftain, commented that during the Chinese rule there was everything, there is nothing now. The Turkic people of Altishahar came to view Yaqub Beg as a Kokandi foreigner, further highlighted by his Kokandi associates' ruthless behaviour towards the local population. Yaqub Beg declared war against the Dungans. Initially, the Turanchi Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang cooperated with the Hui people, or Dungans as they were referred to in many Western countries, when they rose in revolt. Their cooperation was later abandoned by the Turkic Muslims when the Hui attempted to subject the entire region to their rule. The Dungans were massacred at Kulja by the Turanchi and drove those Hui that remained through mountain passes to the Ili Valley. Any Hui people within Xinjiang were not trusted by either the Turkic Muslims or the Qing authorities. Yaqub Beg's army declared a holy war or jihad against the Dungan rebels under the leadership of Tao Ming, also known as Daud Khalifa. Fighting erupted in Xinjiang between the Dungans and Kokandi Uzbek rebels. Tao Ming's army was defeated at the Battle of Urumqi in 1870 as Yaqub Beg began his campaign to conquer Dunzaria and seize all Dungan territory. Yaqub Beg seized Aksu from the Dungans, forcing those rebels that survived north of the Tianshan Mountains. Independent Han Chinese militia, who were not affiliated with the Qing government, joined both sides in the conflict. In 1870, Yaqub Beg had around 1,500 Han Chinese amongst his Turkic forces when attacking the Dungans at Urumqi. The following year, the same Han Chinese militia were fighting for the Dungans against the Turkics. Foreign relations of Kashgaria under Yaqub Beg. Russia and Britain signed several treaties with Yaqub Beg's regime in Kashgar, with Yaqub seeking to secure British and Russian aid for his government. Relations with Russia. Relations between the Russian Empire and Yaqub Beg alternated between fighting and peaceful diplomatic exchanges. The native population of Kashgar was detested by the Russian leaders because of the close contact with the Kokand Khans, whom the Russians had recently expelled from Turkestan. Ottoman and British support. Both the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire recognized Yaqub Beg as a statesman and supplied him with thousands of guns. The British diplomats to Kashgar, Robert Barclay Shaw and Thomas Douglas Forsyth, aroused British interest for Yaqub Beg's regime, and the British concluded a commercial treaty in 1874. Qing reconquest of Xinjiang. The Qing began their attempt to retake Xinjiang in the late 1870s. Zhuo Zongtang, previously a general in the Xian army who oversaw the first wave of the Dungan Revolt, mainly in Gansu Province, was the commander-in-chief of all Qing armies participating in the counter-insurgency. The officers directly under his command were the Han Chinese general Liu Jintang and the Manchu Jin Shun. As Zhuo Zongtang moved his forces into Xinjiang to crush the Muslim rebels under Yaqub Beg, he was joined by Dungan generals Ma Anliang and Dong Fuxiang. Qing armies entered Urumqi unopposed as Yaqub Beg's subordinates either defected to the Qing or fled as the rebel army began to fall apart. Yaqub Beg lost more than 20,000 of his soldiers either through desertion or at the hands of their enemy. Yaqub Beg died in 1877, and the exact cause of his death is unclear. Various reports claimed he died of illness, others claim he took his own life, was killed in battle, or that he was poisoned. The exact date of his death is unclear. Seirami claims he died on the 28th of April, although this is strongly disputed as Nikolai Prehalvsky met with him on the 9th of May. Chinese sources usually give his date of death as the 22nd of May, while Alexei Kuropatkin thought it was the 29th of May. In October 1877, Jin Shun led the forward advance first to Aksu and then on to Ugtapan. Both cities surrendered without a fight. By early December, the assault on the Kashgarian capital began. The rebels were quickly defeated as those that escaped fled to Russian territory. With the fall of Kashgaria, the Qing's reconquest of Xinjiang was complete. No further revolts were encountered, and the Qing authorities began the task of recovery and reorganization that included the establishment of Xinjiang province in 1884. The effective use of Muslims in the Qing armies. The use of Muslims as soldiers within the Qing armies against the revolt was highlighted by the 5 elite divisions that Liu Jintang led. They were all Dungan soldiers. At that time, Dungan military commanders such as Sui Wei and Huan Dukat were commanders that controlled armies of soldiers that had previously surrendered and been deployed into the Qing armies. Furthermore, when Sen Shuying was in charge of military affairs in the southern province of Yunnan, the Muslim soldiers and officers that were employed in his armies included many former rebels, and it was of this that the Muslim revolt in Yunnan was pacified. The above examples of how Muslim soldiers can be deployed effectively, even while Muslim uprisings are still in progress, is testament to how it is an effective tool when used positively. What is more, Dungan, or more precisely, Hui people, have demonstrated not the slightest hint of any erratic behavior that would suggest they are anything but reliable. Aftermath and punishment handed out by the Qing. When the Qing armies under Zhuo Tang put down the Dungan Revolt, the sons of Muslim Hui and Selah rebel leaders in the provinces of Ningxia, Gansu and Qinghai were castrated by the Qing Imperial Household Department once those sons became 11 years old, and then sent to work as eunuch slaves in Qing garrisons in Xinjiang. The wives of rebel leaders were also enslaved. The Imperial Household Department immediately castrated the 9 sons of Ma Guiyang, since they had already reached the required age for castration and were enslaved as eunuchs to the Qing in Xinjiang. The wives of Ma Zenyuan, Ma Benyuan and Ma Guiyuan were all enslaved in provincial garrisons after their husbands were executed. The Muslim rebels themselves were executed by means of a method known as lingqi or slow slicing, also known as death by 1,000 cuts. Children of those leaders deemed too young for castration were imprisoned until they reached the age of castration, and then all served a life of servitude as eunuchs. The corpses of Yaqub Beg and his son Ishana were burned to cinders in full public view. Surviving members of his family, including another 4 of his sons, 4 grandchildren and 4 wives, were imprisoned in Lanzhou, Gansu Province. They either died in prison or were sent for a life of servitude by the Qing government. By 1879, Yaqub Beg's only surviving relatives were 3 of his sons and 1 grandson. All at that time were underage children. Despite this, they were put on trial and would be sentenced to death if they were found to be complicit in their father's or grandfather's rebellious sedition. If found to be innocent, they were to be castrated when becoming of age and serve sentences of servitude as eunuchs. Conclusion: Flight of the Dungans to the Russian Empire. The revolt's failure led to the immigration of some Hui people into Imperial Russia. There are records of at least 3 separate groups of Hui people fleeing to the Russian Empire across the Tian Shan Mountains during the exceptionally severe winter of 1877 to 78. The first group were around 1,000 people from Turpan in Xinjiang who reached Osh in southern Kyrgyzstan. A second, slightly larger group of around 1,300 people were from Dir Daozao in Gansu and settled in the spring of 1878 in eastern Kyrgyzstan. The third group of 3,314 left Shaanxi and fled to Kazakhstan. Another wave of immigration occurred in the early 1880s under the terms of the Treaty of St. Petersburg, signed in February 1881. Russian soldiers were required to withdraw from the Upper Ili Basin. Some Hui and Turanshi people of that region opted to move to the Russian side of the border. According to Russian statistics, 4,682 Hui moved to the Russian Empire under the treaty. They moved in small groups from 1881 until 1883 and settled in a village of Sokyulak, 30 kilometers west of Bishkek, as well as several points between the Chinese border and Sokyulak in southeastern Kazakhstan and northern Kyrgyzstan. Descendants of those migrants still live today across those areas and further afield, and still call themselves Hui. That brings us to the end of this video and the completion of this story about the Hui Muslims and the effect their uprising had on China, particularly on the northwest of the nation. If you enjoyed watching and it's shown you a little detail of life and events here in China, then your subscribing to my channel would mean a lot to me. Thank you for watching. Make sure you click on the link to the next video, and until the next time, goodbye for now.